Welcome back. A health official in Australia says outbreaks of the Delta variant have created a pandemic of the unvaccinated in parts of the country. Melbourne is now in its sixth lockdown to combat a spike in cases. People were just given a few hours' notice before they had to stay indoors. And as you'll see, the news didn't go so well. Anger and frustration on the streets of Melbourne after the Victorian government declares the start of lockdown number 6. Australians unable to leave the country for more than a year now once again face restrictions on leaving their home. Virus-weary demonstrators clashing with police as Australia's largest cities struggle to contain a coronavirus outbreak.
The advice to me from the experts is that if we were to wait even just a few days, there's every chance that instead of being locked down for a week, this gets away from us and we are potentially locked down until we all get vaccinated. And that's months away.
Almost 2/3 of Australia's 25 million people are now under lockdown as the highly contagious Delta variant spreads. Sydney has been under lockdown for over 6 weeks, yet it recorded its worst day of the pandemic on Thursday, with a record rise in locally acquired infections.
The Delta strain is like nothing we've seen, and that's why the vaccine is our key tool. Fortunately, we do have that tool now available in Australia, but we are constrained with some types of supply, obviously, which we've been talking about. But getting jabs into arms will massively help us reduce those case numbers and massively improve our ability to have additional freedoms moving forward.
Until now, Australia had avoided some of the worst consequences of the pandemic in part by shutting itself off from the rest of the world. Since March of 2020, the country has kept its border virtually closed. Tourists are not allowed to enter. Australians can't leave except under special circumstances. And tens of thousands of citizens stranded abroad have registered for government help to return home, help that hasn't come. After more than a year of Fortress Australia, frustration is growing at home and abroad.
We're one of only 2 countries in the world where the citizens aren't allowed to leave the country, and the other is North Korea, which is not one I'd want to be held up against.
I'm hoping that the more we're vaccinated, the more will allow us to be a little bit more liberal in our quarantine systems, our departure systems. Right now, the exemptions are very difficult to obtain, and some people seem to be getting them a lot easier than others.
Australia's Prime Minister said last week that at least 80% of the country's adults will have to be vaccinated for borders to reopen. But with only 20% of those over 16 fully inoculated against the virus, it seems Fortress Australia will stay largely locked down and closed off for the foreseeable future. The Fortress restrictions are keeping many families apart. Australia has tough restrictions for anyone trying to get back into the country, including Australian citizens and also immediate family members of those in the country. But that doesn't include parents. One group is trying to change that. Just before the show, I spoke with Kateryna Dmytriyeva, spokeswoman for Parents Are Immediate Family. So Australia's borders have been virtually shut since March 2020. They don't look like they're going to open until at least 2022. It's almost impossible to get in or get out, which means families like yours, like mine, are cut off. Just explain for us what you've been dealing with.
So my personal situation is fairly common, unfortunately. My mother has been locked out of the country in early March 2020. She went on a short trip back home to renew her visa because she needed to be offshore to do this, and she never returned. Before, she lived with me for about a year and helped me recover from postnatal depression. So she's my main support person, and I really needed her here. So when she got locked out of the country, my mental health quickly deteriorated, and I went through a lengthy application process to apply for a travel exemption for her. I did this 6 times, but no luck.
So 6 times you applied for an exemption, 6 times that was rejected. And I think a lot of people would find it surprising that you can't even leave the country to go to her unless you agree to really quite some tough conditions and again apply for an exemption, right?
Yeah, you need an exemption to leave the country, and it's a fairly similar process to an inward exemption. So you need to provide some like medical documents or any kind of evidence for why you need to leave, and it's up to the bureaucrats and the Home Affairs Department to approve or decline your exemption. And I also know that it is harder to have an exemption approved for families rather than individual travelers. So I need to travel alone because it's going to be hard to take my family with me.
And you'd have to agree to stay out of the country for months.
Yeah, at least 3 months, which is almost impossible if you have a full-time job.
Tens of thousands of people have signed a petition pleading for the Australian government to show some compassion. You've been speaking to thousands of people that are also applying for exemptions. Tell us about the experience from some of those you've spoken to.
Well, yeah, as you said, our petition have gathered almost 70,000 signatures, and we deal with a lot of heartbreaking stories on a daily basis. Just last week, we had a story of a woman who is undergoing cancer treatment, and she was really desperate to get her mother into Australia to support her during chemo. And her application, despite her having like stage 3 cancer, was rejected. And she just messaged our group, Parents for Immediate Family. It's like an advocacy group for people in similar situations. She messaged us for help. And only after some MPs got involved and we had some political pressure applied, her case was reopened and she was granted an exemption. So this is one of the recent examples, but we get examples like this every day. So people are facing really difficult life circumstances, and the process is so hard to navigate, and they get multiple rejections, which basically demotivates them from continuing to apply.
And as far as I understand it, you're in Sydney, currently under lockdown. That lockdown has now been extended. Mentally, how are you coping?
It's been really hard, really. This lockdown, it's hit me really hard, and it looks like it's going to be extended again. We are nowhere near reducing down the case number down to 0. This is what the local government is expecting before they can lift the lockdown. So it's going to be extended for several more weeks, maybe months. So like in the circumstances like this, like we desperately need our support network, but for many overseas born Australians, our support network is overseas.
Just finally, Australia's vaccination rate remains well below the rest of the developed world. It lags incredibly behind. What's your message to the Australian government?
Honestly, like we had this 4-stage plan introduced by the government recently, and for us, it was really disappointing because there is no place for family reunification in this plan, and the vaccination targets that are set to move from one stage to another, they are very high. So my message to the community is go and get vaccinated, but to the government, I think they need to reconsider it, and they need to find a place to family reunification in this plan, and probably not at the later stages of the plan. This needs to happen as soon as possible, because some people are really they're facing some difficult choices. They will need to permanently leave Australia or just see their lives collapsing, basically.
Our thanks to Kateryna Dmytriyeva for coming on the show, and we wish her the very best. Well, still to come, an online protest movement in Zimbabwe marks its first anniversary. So where do things stand a year after the demands for reform? We'll speak with an activist and journalist when we come back.